Have you ever uploaded something to the internet thinking it was just a joke, only to find out you accidentally exposed something way bigger than yourself? That's exactly what happened to 16-year-old Nate, a regular high school junior who thought he was just venting online. He didn't mean for it to go viral. He didn't even mean for anyone outside of his friends to see it. But once that clip hit TikTok, it spread faster than wildfire. And just as the comments started blowing up, Nate spotted someone in the background of the video that stopped him cold. It wasn't just any random person, it was his English teacher. And not just standing there. She was doing something no teacher should ever be doing after hours. Something that Nate definitely wasn't supposed to see or share. Now, before you click away or scroll past thinking this is just another TikTok gone wrong moment, stay with me. Because what Nate uncovered didn't just land him in the principal's office. It opened the door to a secret no one at his school, possibly no one in the district, was ever supposed to find out. This is not a prank. This is not a setup. This is real life. And if you're watching this video right now, you're about to get the full story, the kind of story people whisper about but never talk out loud. And yes, by the end of this video, you will absolutely get the answer you came here for. Let's be real for a second. We live in a time where every teen has a phone in their hand and the power to go viral in seconds. One click, one post, one funny moment caught on camera, and suddenly you're trending with strangers, debating your life. Nate didn't think twice. He was just frustrated, like a lot of us have been. You know that feeling when a teacher just rubs you the wrong way? Too many assignments. That look they give you when you're even 1 minute late. Or the way they act like your whole future depends on comma placement. Yeah, Nate had one of those teachers. So when she gave him detention for chewing gum in class, he got mad. Really mad. And when he saw her later that day outside of school, in a totally different part of town, he hit record on his phone. He uploaded the clip to his private TikTok, titled it something like, "Teachers when they think nobody's watching," added a sarcastic emoji, and let it rip. The video wasn't even 10 seconds long. Just enough to show her walking into a building with a hoodie pulled low, glancing over her shoulder like she didn't want to be seen. Seemed like nothing, right? But here's where things get weird. People in the comments didn't just recognize the teacher, they recognized the building. And not in a good way. One user commented, "Wait, isn't it the old daycare that shut down in 2016? Another wrote, "Pretty sure someone went missing in that place." But the comment that really made Nate's stomach drop? It came from a user with no profile pic, no followers, and just a single comment on the entire account. "You shouldn't have posted this." That was the moment everything shifted. Now, I want you to imagine you're Nate. You're getting more views than you've ever gotten in your life. You're getting DMs, tags, even local news outlets reaching out. But instead of feeling excited or proud, your heart is racing for all the wrong reasons. Because the person you were mocking, your teacher, is suddenly the center of an investigation. And you might have accidentally blown open a case that had been cold for nearly a decade. Stick with me here because in this story, every second counts. What starts as a petty post spirals into hidden identities, old crimes, and a trail of lies buried just beneath the surface of a normal American high school. You'll meet a teacher who isn't who she says she is, a student who finds himself in over his head, and a community forced to confront a truth it's been ignoring for years. We're going to talk about how easily a joke can become evidence, and how what you record can change your life forever, even if you never meant it to. But listen, this isn't just about Nate. It's about you too. Because we've all posted something we probably shouldn't have. We've all thought, what's the worst that could happen? Maybe you've even hit upload, only to delete it seconds later. But what if someone saw it? What if someone downloaded it? What if it wasn't a joke at all? That's the real question we're diving into today. And by the time we reach the end of the story, I promise you, you'll never look at a short video clip the same way again. Now, before we go any further, let me be clear. I'm not here to cancel anyone. This isn't about blame or shame. This is about telling the truth behind a viral moment that started with a grudge and ended with a knock on Nate's front door. Because just 3 days after that video went live, someone showed up at his house. Not a classmate, not a teacher, not even a cop, at least not one from town. This person had questions, credentials, and a file thicker than a phone book. And what they revealed to Nate. It wasn't just about what he saw in that video, it was about who his teacher really was. You're going to want to stick around for this. Because just when you think the truth has been uncovered, just when you think this can't get any darker, it does. And it all begins with one video. Nate hadn't meant for any of this to spiral. Honestly, he was just trying to blow off steam. The school year had already been rough. His grades were slipping, he was behind on assignments, and he was constantly butting heads with his English teacher, Ms. Carol Maddox. She was one of those teachers who ran her classroom like a courtroom, strict rules, cold eyes, and zero room for excuses. To her, everything was black and white. Either you did the work or you didn't. And Nate, who had always gotten by on charm and last-minute effort, found himself running into walls for the first time. But it wasn't just the grades. It was the way she looked at him. Like she knew something about him he didn't know himself. Sometimes during class, he'd catch her watching him when he wasn't talking. Not with anger, more like recognition. And the strangest part? He could never remember having her before, not even in passing. She transferred to their school just 2 months earlier, supposedly from a district out of state. But no one could really remember the name of the school she came from, or why the previous teacher she replaced had abruptly resigned. Things at home weren't much easier. His parents had been arguing more, especially about money. His dad's hours at the local dealership were getting cut, and his mom picked up a third cleaning job just to keep them afloat. The tension in the house felt like it followed him to school, and the only place Nate felt like he had some control was online. TikTok, YouTube Shorts, even private Snapchat stories. He wasn't a creator. Not officially, but his friends always said he had the best captions and knew how to roast someone just right. That's where the idea for the video came from. It was supposed to be petty, not personal. A quick joke at Ms. Maddox's expense, something that would get a few laughs in the group chat, and maybe earn him some clout. But once it blew up, things turned serious fast. After the image came through, just a zoomed-in screenshot of the video he'd already posted, Nate felt the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. Not because of the face in the reflection, which was unnerving enough, but because of what came next. His phone buzzed again, and this time it was a message. You saw her. You saw him too. He didn't know what that meant. He didn't want to know. But when he tried to respond, the number was already disconnected. The messages disappeared. Like they were never there. The thing was, Nate wasn't even sure what he'd seen in the video. At first, all he'd noticed was Ms. Maddox going into the old building. A crumbling daycare center that had been boarded up for nearly a decade. Everyone in town had a story about that place. Some said it caught fire. Others said it shut down after a lawsuit involving one of the staff. No one ever gave a clear answer. Most people just stayed away. But in the zoomed-in shot, the reflection in the window showed a second person standing behind her. Not a passerby. Not someone walking by in the distance. This person was watching her. Or maybe waiting for her. The face was blurry, but it was definitely male. And there was something about it that felt out of place. Almost like it didn't belong in this time, like it had been plucked from an old yearbook and dropped into the frame. Nate didn't show anyone the image at first. Not even his closest friend Jordan, who had been with him when he filmed the video. Jordan had a knack for conspiracy theories, aliens, secret tunnels under the school, hidden cameras and vending machines. He would have run wild with this, but Nate needed answers, not speculation. So he decided to dig a little. Just enough to understand what he'd stumbled into. He searched Ms. Maddox online, tried to find her on social media. Nothing came up under her name. No Facebook. No Instagram. Not even a LinkedIn profile. For a teacher in her 30s, that was rare. The only mention he could find was in a cached PDA newsletter from a different school district, 5 hours away. It listed her as a guest literacy consultant, but there was no picture, no background, no reason for the temporary role. And it was dated nearly 6 years ago. At school, things started to shift. Ms. Maddox seemed colder, but also cautious. She stopped calling on Nate in class. She avoided eye contact. At one point, he could have sworn he saw her erase something on her whiteboard when she noticed him staring. And during a fire drill, she stayed behind just a moment too long, watching the hallway like she expected someone to walk through it. But here's where things get really strange. The day after the video went viral, another teacher went missing. Mr. Reynolds, the guidance counselor who had been at the school for over 15 years. No goodbye, no notice, not even an email. Students were told he had a family emergency and wouldn't be returning. But Jordan swore he saw Reynolds talking to Ms. Maddox 2 days before, and that it wasn't a friendly conversation. He described it like Reynolds was begging her for something. And she just stood there, calm, unblinking, like she was in control. Nate started keeping a journal. Not online, just a regular notebook. He wrote down everything. The messages, the video, the comments that had since disappeared. Even the things that didn't make sense. Like how his phone started acting weird around certain people. The battery would drain if Ms. Maddox was within 10 feet. His camera would glitch if he tried to take a photo of her. At first, he thought it was a coincidence. Maybe paranoia. But when a classmate named Haley, who barely knew Nate but sat behind him in history, slipped him a folded note during lunch that read, "You're not crazy. I saw her too." He knew something was seriously wrong. That's when the red flags started piling up. Rumors spread about Ms. Maddox's past. One student claimed she'd taught at a school that closed under mysterious circumstances. Another said they found a photo of her in an old newspaper article about a missing child case, but the photo was dated from the early 2000s, and she looked exactly the same. No aging. No change. Just the same piercing stare and severe expression. Nate didn't want to believe it. But every time he tried to fact-check something, the trail would vanish. Links broken. Articles scrubbed. Even Google Maps stopped showing the inside of the daycare building after the video went viral. It was like someone or something was covering their tracks. And then there was the janitor, Mr. Earl. Quiet, barely spoke, always kept to himself. Nate never gave him much thought until he caught him outside near the edge of the school grounds, burning a small stack of papers in a rusted barrel. At first, Nate thought it was trash. But then he saw a school ID melting in the flames. Reynolds' ID. When Nate stepped closer, Mr. Earl just gave him a long look and said, "Some things you don't post. Some things you bury." Nate didn't know who to trust anymore. Not his teachers. Not the school. Maybe not even his friends. Because suddenly, everyone seemed to have a connection to Ms. Maddox they weren't admitting. And the more he tried to unravel the truth, the deeper the web became. The question wasn't just who his teacher really was, it was why she was here.
And what she was trying so hard to keep hidden.
But the next clue? That would come from the least expected place of all. And once Nate found it, there would be no turning back. Nate had been planning to return to the abandoned daycare center ever since he spotted Ms. Maddox entering it in the video. But he knew he couldn't do it alone. After a few days of mounting pressure, he finally told Jordan everything. The mysterious text messages, the reflection in the glass, the disappearing comments, and Mr. Earl's bizarre warning. Jordan was skeptical at first, but the more Nate talked, the more it started to make a twisted kind of sense. So they made a plan. Jordan would keep watch while Nate went inside, using a GoPro strapped to his chest to record everything. But when they arrived at the daycare just before sunset, something was off. The boards that once covered the windows were gone, neatly stacked by the side wall, like someone had just removed them. The door wasn't locked. It creaked open without resistance, and there were fresh footprints in the dust-covered floor, leading toward the back rooms. Nate raised the camera and took a slow step forward, but before they could go any further, a flashlight beam swept across the hallway from inside. They ducked behind a cracked bookshelf, hearts pounding. Someone else was already in there. They waited in silence until the light faded, and then made their way back to the street, deciding to regroup before doing anything reckless. But the next day, when Nate went to retrieve the footage from the GoPro's SD card, he was met with a blank folder. Not corrupted, just empty. No error message. No signs of damage. As if the camera had never been turned on. He was sure he hit record. Jordan had even tested the battery before they left. But now, the only evidence they had was gone. And that's when Nate's phone lit up again. A new message. No number. No contact. Just 6 words. Last warning. You're not invisible. Nate's hands were shaking. He'd never told anyone else what he was doing, not even his mom. Yet someone clearly knew. Someone was watching. That night, he checked his bedroom window twice, pulled the curtains closed, and unplugged his phone before going to sleep. But sleep didn't come easy. His mind kept drifting back to Ms. Maddox, to the way she watched him without blinking, as if she were waiting for him to figure something out. And then there was the janitor, Mr. Earl. What exactly was he burning? Was he protecting her, or protecting someone else? Maybe even himself? By Monday, school felt like a minefield. A few students were whispering that the video had been taken down, not by Nate, but somehow erased from the platform entirely. Even Jordan's copy was gone from his private account. TikTok flagged it as violating community guidelines, but there was nothing in the footage that broke any rules. It wasn't graphic, didn't include names or threats. It just disappeared, like someone had scrubbed it from the internet. Nate started noticing other things too. Ms. Maddox's desk now had a locked drawer that she always kept a key around her neck for. And she never left the classroom unattended anymore. When she walked the halls, teachers nodded at her with a kind of uneasy respect, not friendliness. Like they were afraid of her, or maybe bound by something unspoken. Even Principal Daly, who usually cracked jokes with students, looked nervous when she was near. Then, out of nowhere, an email showed up in Nate's inbox from someone named Samuel_retired_54 at Outlook. The subject line read, "I worked with her once. You're in danger." There was no body text, just a file attachment labeled Winter_2006. Nate downloaded it, half expecting it to be a virus, but it opened a grainy black and white photo. A group of teachers standing in front of a snow-covered school building. Ms. Maddox was there, dead center, wearing the same hairstyle she is now, same serious expression. Only this photo was clearly decades old. Everyone else in the picture looked appropriately aged. But she hadn't changed at all. The date and location on the image were partially faded, but Nate could make out the words, Wilson Grove District and Staff Reassignment. A quick search for Wilson Grove pulled up an old news article about a school shooting that occurred in that district. The shooter was never identified. The school closed 2 weeks later. The story had been buried, but there were whispers of a faculty cover-up and a student who vanished before graduation. Some blamed the teacher. Others blamed the administration. But no one had answers. At lunch, Nate confronted Haley, the girl who had slipped in the note, and asked if she knew more. She hesitated, glancing around before pulling him into the side stairwell. "You need to stop digging," she whispered. "I used to go to her old school. Not long, just for a semester. But I saw things."
People changed.
Teachers disappeared. And Maddox, she was always there. Always watching. Nate pressed her for more, but she clammed up, eyes darting behind him like someone might be listening. She handed him a worn key with a small tag that read Electrical, Main Hall, and said, "Don't go alone." Later that evening, Nate broke into the school. He waited until dark, climbed through the unlocked side window they always used during senior pranks, and made his way to the electrical room. The key worked. Inside, he found more than just wires and switches. There were boxes, stacks of old files, folders marked staff incidents, student reports, and, most chilling of all, recordings. He grabbed what he could and slipped out before anyone noticed. But when he opened the first file at home, the pages had been removed. Every folder was empty. Just one note left behind on school letterhead, written in sharp black ink. "You already know too much. Don't become part of the record." And then, just as Nate stared at the note in disbelief, the power in his house went out. Total blackout, followed by a single knock at the front door.
Slow.
Deliberate. Not loud enough to be a visitor, but just enough to let him know. Someone was there. Watching. Waiting. Nate didn't move at first. His breath caught in his throat as the quiet knock echoed through the dark, powerless house. The glow from his phone was the only light in the room, and even that began to flicker unnaturally, like something was interfering with it. He waited, frozen, listening for footsteps or a voice outside the front door, but there was nothing. No sound of retreating footsteps. No headlights in the street. Just silence pressing in from all sides. Then, just when he began to think he'd imagined it, his phone buzzed again. This time it wasn't a text. It was an airdrop request. From unknown device. No name. No icon. Just a chilling message. He's next. Attached was a blurry screenshot of Jordan, his best friend, sitting alone in the school's computer lab, time-stamped just 10 minutes earlier. Nate immediately tried to call Jordan, but the line wouldn't connect. Panic flared in his chest as he grabbed his jacket and flashlight and bolted out of the house, phone in hand. He biked to the school, ignoring every instinct screaming at him to turn around. But by the time he reached the building, the parking lot was empty and the lights were off. No sign of Jordan. No one answering the door. He circled the building twice, then finally noticed the side entrance near the faculty wing was slightly ajar, exactly like it had been when he found the electrical room. Inside, the hallways were darker than usual, and there was a strange metallic smell hanging in the air, like overheated wires or burnt plastic. He moved carefully, checking each door, until he reached the computer lab. The room was empty, but Jordan's backpack was still there, zipped and upright on the chair. And next to it, something that didn't belong, an old cassette tape. Unlabeled. Just sitting in the middle of the desk with no explanation. That night, they tried playing the tape on an old recorder Jordan's dad kept in the garage. At first, it was just static. But then a voice filtered through, faint, warped, and full of interference. It wasn't a student's voice. It sounded older, more strained, like someone speaking from the bottom of a deep well. "They don't forget," it said. "They don't forgive. We buried it, but she remembers. Stop before she remembers you." Then silence. No timestamp. No clear context. Just that voice echoing again and again in Nate's head. Jordan had no memory of seeing the tape before, let alone leaving it behind. But the fact that it mentioned a she made one thing clear: they weren't just dealing with secrets anymore. They were being hunted. The next day, everything got worse. Ms. Maddox was suddenly absent, without warning or explanation. The school's front office claimed she had taken an emergency leave, but didn't say when or if she was coming back. Her classroom was sealed off with a temporary maintenance sign taped to the door. Students whispered that she had been fired, or arrested, or worse. But Nate knew better. This wasn't about punishment. It was about covering tracks. That same afternoon, Haley texted Nate in a panic. Someone had broken into her car overnight, but nothing was stolen. Instead, she found a single Polaroid photo on her dashboard, one that showed her standing at the exact stairwell where she had spoken with Nate, except the picture had been taken from above, like someone had been watching them from the vents or ceiling. On the back of the photo, a message scrawled in faded red ink. "You told him. Now he'll see." Nate and Jordan decided to investigate the Wilson Grove incident deeper. They combed through forums, archives, even Facebook pages of old alumni. That's when they found something that made their blood run cold. An old blog post from 2007 written by a former student who claimed that teachers from Wilson Grove were relocated after the shutdown, and that one specific faculty member, their favorite science teacher, had vanished before the relocation paperwork was finalized. The post included a photo of the science fair winners from that year. Front and center was a young girl with sharp eyes and a stern smile, wearing a name tag that read, Maddox. But according to the school's yearbook, no Maddox was ever officially employed there. It was like she had simply inserted herself and no one questioned it. And then came the real twist. Late that night, Jordan's mom, who worked nights at the county records office, called him in a panic. She had stumbled across something during routine database maintenance, a file marked restricted under the name Maddox Mallory. The file was locked, but what disturbed her most was the attached notation: emergency protocol. Do not engage. Former asset. Case closed under Project Lantern. She hadn't meant to access it. The document was buried so deep, she had to override 3 permissions just to see the preview. But someone must have been monitoring access, because less than 5 minutes later, her entire terminal went black. And now she was scared someone was watching them. Nate knew then that this wasn't just about a bad teacher with a shady past. Something larger was at play. Some kind of operation. A cover-up that stretched beyond just one district or one school. If Ms. Maddox had once been part of some government or private program, if she had been involved in a project called Lantern, then maybe she wasn't just dangerous. Maybe she wasn't even acting alone. But before Nate could dig further, another airdrop request came through to his phone, this time while he was in class. It was a video clip, just 5 seconds long, but it changed everything. In the grainy, time-stamped footage, he saw himself, asleep in his bed, the camera angled from just inside his closet door. At the end of the clip, the closet creaked slightly and something moved behind the slats. That's when Nate realized this wasn't about uncovering the past anymore. This was about surviving the present. Nate barely slept that night. Every creak of the house sounded like a whisper aimed directly at him. Every gust of wind against the windows felt deliberate, like someone was outside, watching, waiting. The image from the video played on a loop in his mind. The flicker of movement behind the closet door, the subtle shift in darkness that confirmed it wasn't just a trick of the light. He'd searched the closet after watching it, rifled through jackets, shoes, storage boxes, but found nothing. Still, that didn't settle anything. Whoever had taken that video had been inside his house, inside his room, and had gotten out without a trace. His parents didn't believe him when he tried to explain it the next morning, chalking it up to stress and too much time online. But something had changed in Nate after that clip. This was no longer about solving a mystery for curiosity's sake. It was about staying one step ahead of someone that was now inside his life in ways he couldn't predict or understand. At school, things only got worse. Jordan didn't show up to homeroom, and by second period, his phone was going straight to voicemail. Nate assumed maybe he was shaken up and laying low for a bit. But when he stopped by Jordan's house after school, what he saw made his stomach drop. The front door was wide open, the interior lights still on, and no cars in the driveway. Nate called out, cautiously stepping inside, and that's when he saw it. Jordan's laptop smashed on the kitchen floor, his mom's coffee mug shattered nearby, still steaming slightly. It had happened recently. A cold, metallic scent lingered in the air, like ozone after a lightning strike. But the most disturbing thing was the message scrawled across the fridge in something that looked a lot like dry erase marker, but didn't quite wipe away. You knew. Now you're next. The police were called, of course, but the responding officer didn't seem nearly as alarmed as Nate expected. He noted the scene, nodded thoughtfully, and said things like, probably just a break-in and we'll file a report, but never asked Nate any real questions about the messages or the missing family. It was like they didn't want to pursue it. Or worse, like they already knew what this was. Nate watched the cruiser drive off, his heart pounding, his mind spiraling into a dozen unanswered questions. He tried calling Haley, but she wasn't picking up either. Her last message to him, hours earlier, had been a cryptic voice memo, just 5 seconds of heavy breathing, followed by a whisper. They're in the system. Don't trust what you see. That night, Nate locked every door and window, even barricaded his bedroom with a chair. But none of it helped. Because the fear wasn't just that someone would break in, it was the idea that someone already had. He couldn't shake the feeling that every time he turned around, something in his environment had changed slightly. The angle of a picture frame. The way his backpack sat on the floor. His email inbox was suddenly empty, even though he hadn't deleted anything. His text to Jordan now showed a single checkmark, sent, but never delivered. He checked his school account and found it had been locked due to suspicious activity. And his browser history had a search he didn't remember typing, Project Lantern surveillance protocols. His laptop camera light flickered briefly, though the screen was off. Someone was tracking every click, every move, every breath. As the paranoia grew, so did the hallucinations, or what Nate hoped were hallucinations. He began seeing the same woman's face in crowds, in reflections, in dreams. Always partially obscured, always in the background, always with eyes that seemed to follow him wherever he went. He'd glance at a TV in the background of a store and see her just for a moment before the image distorted. He once caught a glimpse of her face in a raindrop on his window, perfectly reflected like a projection. And strangest of all, when he dug through an old family photo album looking for anything any detail that might connect him to Ms. Maddox or Wilson Grove. He found a picture from his own 7th birthday party. In the background, at the edge of the yard, half hidden behind a tree, was a woman. Dark hair, faint smile, eyes locked on the camera. The same woman. But this was years before Ms. Maddox had ever arrived at their school. Desperate, Nate tried to reach out to his school counselor for help. Maybe not the full story, but enough to see if someone would listen. But when he arrived at the office, the room was empty, completely cleared out. No furniture, no files, no trace that anyone had worked there. And taped to the door was a single sticky note. Some answers cost too much. He turned to run, but someone was already standing at the end of the hall. A tall man in a custodian's uniform, face obscured by the shadows. Nate called out, but the figure didn't respond.
Just stood there,
watching, then slowly walked away, without a word. Everything was unraveling. People were disappearing. Memories were shifting. Nate no longer trusted what was real and what was planted. He started to wonder if even his past had been rewritten somehow, if this entire nightmare wasn't just about something hidden in the school, but something buried inside him. The sense of isolation was crushing. He felt like a ghost walking through his own life, surrounded by people who didn't realize the walls were closing in. But the final blow came when he checked his voicemail one last time that night and found a new message, one that made his skin crawl. It was from Jordan, except it wasn't his voice. It sounded altered, distorted, like it had been run through software to mimic his tone. "You were right," the message said, pausing between words. "But you should have stopped.
She remembers you now.
And she never forgets." Nate stood frozen, the phone trembling in his hand, a cold sweat breaking across his back. Somewhere deep inside, he knew this was no longer about what had happened in the past. This was about what was still happening. And worse, what was coming next. Nate didn't expect the twist to come from his own home. After everything that had happened, Jordan disappearing, the distorted voicemail, the vanishing guidance office, he'd been looking outward for answers. Searching cameras, combing through old emails, stalking down leads in school records and shady back halls. But the truth had been simmering in his own house the entire time. It started with a casual question, his mom asking if he was feeling better, if his episodes were under control again. He blinked, confused. "Episodes?" he asked. She brushed it off at first, then sighed, placing her hand gently on his shoulder as if preparing him for something heavy. "We agreed not to talk about it unless it came back," she said softly. "You promised to let it go. After what happened in 6th grade." That one phrase shattered everything. 6th grade. Nate's mind reeled. He had no memory of anything particularly dramatic that year, no trauma, no breakdown. Just a quiet period where he'd been pulled from school for family reasons and homeschooled for a few months. That was the official version. But now his mother's eyes were filled with something else. Fear, maybe guilt, definitely secrets. He pressed her for answers. She resisted, at first gently, then nervously, until finally she told him the part that detonated his entire reality. Ms. Maddox wasn't new to their school. She had taught there before, years ago, under a different name. Back then, she had been his therapist. Part of a quiet trial program at Wilson Grove designed for students with behavioral and psychological irregularities. Nate had been one of the first. The video, he thought, had started it all. It hadn't started anything. It was a reminder. He'd blacked it out. All of it. A whole season of his life. But the buried memories started clawing their way back the moment his mother spoke those words. The sterile white room with no windows. The shadowy figures behind glass. The voice recordings he was told to listen to every night. Something about operant programming and response conditioning. It hadn't been therapy. It had been a test. And Ms. Maddox had been more than a teacher. She'd been a handler. The ground beneath Nate's mind cracked wide open. Every interaction he'd had with her since she joined, the school now replayed with new, horrifying context. The way she'd looked at him during that first rude video, the flicker of recognition in her eyes wasn't surprise. It was memory. She knew who he was. She'd been watching him. Maybe the glitch in the closet video wasn't a threat from someone else. It might have been a trigger. A planned moment to wake him up. To bring him back online. And the twist didn't stop there. He broke into his father's locked filing cabinet that night, something he never thought to touch before, and found a folder with a single word stamped on the front: lantern. Inside were documents, clinical notes, timestamps, faded photographs, security clearance badges. He barely recognized himself in some of the images, hooked to monitors, wires on his head, eyes wide and dazed. A few pages deeper, there was a list of names. Haley's was on it. So was Jordan's. And beneath each name, 2 columns: memory protocol status and response integrity. Next to Jordan's name was a red stamp: decommissioned. Next to Haley's, pending reset. Nate's row was marked differently: asset in flux, monitor closely. Suddenly, the disappearances, the cryptic messages, the warning signs, they weren't part of a mystery someone else was controlling. They were part of him. He wasn't uncovering a conspiracy. He was the conspiracy. Everything he'd believed, everything he trusted, every person he'd thought was safe, they were either part of the program or casualties of it. His whole life might have been scripted, looped, rewritten. And he'd been left with a single command, buried so deep he hadn't even known it was there: find her. Remember. Activate. But who had planted that command? And why now? The folder gave no answers. Just a handwritten post-it tucked into the back that said, "If you're reading this, she's already seen you. Do not engage. Do not trust the mirror." Nate stood frozen in the kitchen, the weight of all this pressing down on his chest like a vice. The mirror. He turned slowly toward the hallway. There, just past the threshold, was the hallway mirror, an old, decorative thing with gilded corners. He'd walked past it every day of his life. But now he noticed something for the first time. His reflection wasn't quite right. It blinked a beat too late. It smiled just slightly when he wasn't smiling at all. Nate didn't sleep that night, not really. He sat on the edge of his bed, the glow of his laptop casting harsh shadows on the walls, the folder from his father's cabinet spread out beside him like evidence from someone else's life. Every time he glanced at the hallway mirror, he swore he could feel it watching back. His thoughts were a storm, questions turning over themselves so violently he could barely breathe. What did "monitor closely" even mean? Why did it say Haley was pending a reset? And what the hell did "decommissioned" mean for Jordan? There were no answers in the folder, just clinical jargon and redacted lines. But there was one thing he couldn't stop circling back to: his mom. If she knew even a piece of it, how deep was she in? How much had she helped cover up? How much had she hidden behind that warm smile, those quiet reassurances that everything was just stress or teen anxiety? He hated what he had to do next, but he needed the truth more than he needed comfort. At 2:14 a.m., he finally walked downstairs. The TV was off, the house dead silent except for the soft hum of the refrigerator. His mom was still awake, sitting on the couch with a half-empty glass of wine in her hand, staring blankly at nothing. She didn't even flinch when he approached. "You knew," Nate said quietly. She didn't deny it, didn't even pretend to be confused. She just exhaled, slow and painful, like she'd been holding that breath for years. "They told us it was to help you," she said, voice trembling. "They said it would make your life easier, that it would keep you safe." The way she said they sent a chill through his spine. He asked her who they were, but she shook her head. "We signed an NDA, Nate. I could go to prison for even saying this much. And if you push it, they won't come for me. They'll come for you. Again. Again." Suddenly, the disappearances, the cryptic messages, the warning signs, they weren't part of a mystery someone else was controlling. They were part of him. He wasn't uncovering a conspiracy. He was the conspiracy. Everything he believed, everything he trusted, every person he'd thought was safe, they were either part of the program or casualties of it. His whole life might have been scripted, looped, rewritten. And he'd been left with a single command, buried so deep he hadn't even known it was there: find her. Remember. Activate. But who had planted that command? And why now? The folder gave no answers. Just a handwritten post-it tucked into the back that said, "If you're reading this, she's already seen you. Do not engage. Do not trust the mirror." Nate stood frozen in the kitchen, the weight of all this pressing down on his chest like a vice. The mirror. He turned slowly toward the hallway. There, just past the threshold, was the hallway mirror, an old, decorative thing with gilded corners. He'd walked past it every day of his life. But now, he noticed something for the first time. His reflection wasn't quite right. It blinked a beat too late. It smiled just slightly when he wasn't smiling at all. Nate didn't sleep that night, not really. He sat on the edge of his bed, the glow of his laptop casting harsh shadows on the walls, the folder from his father's cabinet spread out beside him like evidence from someone else's life. Every time he glanced at the hallway mirror, he swore he could feel it watching back. His thoughts were a storm, questions turning over themselves so violently he could barely breathe. What did "monitor closely" even mean? Why did it say Haley was pending a reset? And what the hell did "decommissioned" mean for Jordan? There were no answers in the folder, just clinical jargon and redacted lines. But there was one thing he couldn't stop circling back to: his mom. If she knew even a piece of it, how deep was she in? How much had she helped cover up? How much had she hidden behind that warm smile, those quiet reassurances that everything was just stress or teen anxiety? He hated what he had to do next, but he needed the truth more than he needed comfort. At 2:14 a.m., he finally walked downstairs. The TV was off, the house dead silent except for the soft hum of the refrigerator. His mom was still awake, sitting on the couch with a half-empty glass of wine in her hand, staring blankly at nothing. She didn't even flinch when he approached. "You knew," Nate said quietly. She didn't deny it, didn't even pretend to be confused. She just exhaled, slow and painful, like she'd been holding that breath for years. "They told us it was to help you," she said, voice trembling. "They said it would make your life easier, that it would keep you safe." The way she said they sent a chill through his spine. He asked her who they were, but she shook her head. "We signed an NDA, Nate. I could go to prison for even saying this much. And if you push it, they won't come for me. They'll come for you. Again. Again." The word hit him like a freight train. He wasn't asking questions anymore. He was demanding. "What did they do to me?" His mother began to cry. "They erased things. Rewired things. They said it was necessary because of what you saw, what you remembered too early." She pulled a crumpled envelope from behind the cushion and handed it to him, whispering, "This came for you last week. I didn't want to give it to you, but I think they knew I'd break eventually." The envelope had no return address, just his name, printed in blocky letters. Inside was a single Polaroid. It showed Nate at age 11, sitting at a metal table across from a young girl. Her face was familiar, too familiar. It was Haley, but she looked different, like a version of herself scrubbed clean of personality. On the back, scrawled in pen, were the words, "One of you remembers. One of you obeys." He felt sick. His mom told him the program had been abandoned years ago after an internal scandal, but certain assets, as they called the kids, were kept under observation for anomalies. Nate had been monitored since 6th grade, along with others who had shown cognitive deviation. That's why they'd moved houses. Why his records were missing years. Why certain teachers always seemed to rotate through without notice. Why his best friend Jordan disappeared without a trace, and no one at school even mentioned it after a week. Because the system made people forget. That was part of the protocol. And then came the ultimatum. His mom held up a second envelope. This one sealed, unopened. "This was delivered this morning. It's addressed to me, but I didn't open it." He hesitated, then took it and pulled out a letter printed on thick paper with an official-looking seal he didn't recognize. It was a directive, not a request. It said, "Cease all personal investigation immediately. Any further breach of protocol will result in full reinstatement of cognitive barriers or permanent asset termination." At the bottom was a handwritten note. "You have 48 hours to comply." Haley does not have that long. The weight of it nearly crushed him. He had to choose, Back off and forget everything. Go back to his curated life with no knowledge of what had been done to him. Or keep digging and risk not only his life, but Haley's. It wasn't even clear what termination meant in this context. Could they actually kill him? Or would they just wipe his mind clean again? Maybe that was worse. Maybe losing who he was, what made him real, was the most terrifying possibility of all. Nate didn't know who to trust anymore. Not his mom, not his memories, and certainly not the world that kept feeding him lies dressed up as safety. He considered going to the cops, but even that felt foolish. How do you report a conspiracy that lives in the shadows and deletes proof before you can even name it? He needed someone outside the system, someone who remembered what the system wanted erased. That's when he remembered a name he'd read in the folder, a former student listed as non-responsive to programming, who had been labeled as a threat and marked as missing. Her name was Savannah Rourke, and the last known address was barely a 2-hour drive from where he lived now. If she was still alive, she might be the only one who could help him. But the more he thought about her file, the more he remembered the final note scrawled at the bottom of her page. Subject exhibited full recall, complete defiance, and unpredictable aggression. Last seen holding mirror. Nate barely made it out of town without being followed, or so he thought. Every rear-view glance felt like a countdown, every passing car another set of eyes. His hands trembled on the wheel, not from caffeine or adrenaline, but the sheer knowledge that whatever he was driving toward was either going to answer everything or destroy what was left of his sanity. The address from Savannah Rourke's file led to an abandoned farmhouse deep in the woods outside the city, the kind of place you'd think twice about entering even in daylight. But he didn't hesitate. Not after what he'd seen. Not after the letter. Not after what his own mother confessed. The world around him had already cracked open. He had no choice but to step through the fault line. The front door wasn't locked. That should have been a warning. Inside, the air was thick with dust, stale like it had been shut off from time itself. The file folder open. Hundreds of names, some familiar, some blurred from his memory, like shadows in fog. Haley.
Jordan.
Himself. Even his teacher, Mr. Keating. They were all listed under something called Project Mirrorline. He clicked a video file dated only 3 days ago. It showed a grainy security feed, a room with blank walls, a two-way mirror, and a teenager strapped to a chair. It wasn't Haley. It was someone else, someone Nate vaguely remembered from freshman year, who had moved away suddenly. His name was Dylan, and he was crying. Not out of pain, but confusion. A voice off-screen calmly repeated, "Tell me what you remember about the original event. Begin at the mirror." And then the camera glitched. When it came back on, Dylan was completely still, glassy-eyed, silent, as if someone had switched him off. Nate's breath caught in his throat as he heard a floorboard creak behind him. He turned, but instead of Savannah, he saw someone he never expected. Mr. Keating, his history teacher. The same teacher he'd included in the rude TikTok that started all of this. Except now the man standing before him looked nothing like the harmless, awkward educator he'd mocked. This version of Keating was calm, cold, precise. "You were never supposed to find this place," he said quietly. "But I suppose that's what makes you a deviation." Nate demanded answers, but Keating wasn't there to explain. He was there to end it. "You were marked years ago, Nate. We let you roam because we needed to see how much would resurface. The video, the one you thought you leaked? It wasn't an accident. It was a trigger. You weren't supposed to notice what was in the background, but you did. And that told us you were active again." Nate backed away, trying to process the avalanche of revelation. The video had been bait. This entire unraveling, the folder, the Polaroid, even the letter his mom gave him, was a test.
To see if he would chase the thread.
And he had. Keating moved closer. "Savannah never lived here.
She's gone.
You're standing in a controlled memory anchor, a reconstruction used for observational recall." Nate's heart dropped. The laptop, the video files, they weren't real. They were placed there like props on a stage. And the farmhouse? Probably rigged with monitoring equipment watching his every move, recording every reaction. He'd walked into a trap designed not to contain him, but to confirm him. The air grew colder, And Nate realized just how deep this went. Project Mirrorline wasn't just a localized experiment. It was national. The folder showed students across different states, schools where unexplained events occurred, towns with oddly high rates of missing persons and memory disorders. This wasn't a rogue government op, it was embedded in education systems, in community programs, in therapy clinics. Everywhere parents signed waivers they never fully read. As Keating reached into his coat, Nate saw it, a thin device with a blinking light, the same kind used in that grainy footage with Dylan. "I'm giving you one chance," Keating said. "We can stabilize your cognitive imprint. You'll forget all of this. You'll wake up safe, at home. Haley will be fine. Jordan too." Or, he didn't finish. He didn't have to. But before Nate could respond, the lights in the room cut out. Complete blackness swallowed everything. And in that moment, a voice whispered in his ear from the darkness. "He's lying.
Run."
It wasn't Keating's voice. It was female. It was Savannah. Everything Nate thought he knew had just been rewritten again. Nate staggered backward as the lights cut, swallowed by total darkness that pulsed with tension, as if the air itself was holding its breath. He couldn't hear Mr. Keating anymore, just the low hum of hidden machinery and the sound of his own heartbeat pounding against his ribcage like a war drum. Then came the voice again. Savannah's. Not from a speaker, not from his memory, but close, real. "Nate, this way," she whispered, her breath suddenly on his neck. He turned and reached blindly, his fingers brushing her arm before she tugged him hard through a narrow doorway that had been concealed behind a false wall. They ran down a tight corridor, lit only by faint, flickering emergency lights, the pounding of footsteps behind them growing louder, more urgent, as Keating's calm voice echoed off the walls. "Don't make this harder than it needs to be. You don't know what you're dealing with."
But Nate did know now.
Every puzzle piece had snapped into place during that final moment before the power cut. Savannah wasn't just some fellow truth-seeker. She had been part of it, deeply embedded, once a handler inside the Mirrorline program. That's how she had access to everything. That's how she knew where the files were, how to trace the original video source, how to erase surveillance footage before the school could pull it. But something had gone wrong. She'd broken protocol. Maybe she got too close to one of the subjects. Maybe she started remembering things they wiped from her too. Now, she was being hunted just like him. And Nate, unknowingly, had been the final loose end all along, the one variable that refused to be reprogrammed. They burst out into the cold night behind the farmhouse, sprinting through thick woods where cell service was dead and drones hummed overhead like distant wasps. Savannah shoved a small drive into Nate's hand as they ducked behind a fallen tree, both of them panting, her eyes fierce and terrified at once. "That's everything," she said. "All the memory wipe logs. All the experiments. You post that, it doesn't just expose the program, it breaks their sync network. Every subject starts remembering at once. They won't be able to contain it." But even then, Nate hesitated. He wasn't sure if he trusted her. If this was just another layer of manipulation, another carefully orchestrated path he was being herded down. "Why me?" he asked. "Why that video? Why now?" Savannah shook her head. "Because you weren't supposed to notice. But you did. And not just that, you remembered more than anyone ever has. The TikTok video wasn't your mistake, it was your trigger. And it worked."
She paused.
"You don't get it, do you? You weren't just part of this. You were the first subject. The original." The words hit harder than a gunshot. Nate reeled. His childhood, the strange blank spots in his memory, the faces he recognized before meeting, the moments of déjà vu that always lingered longer than they should have. It wasn't random. It was manufactured. His entire personality may have been sculpted in that hidden lab. And now, because of one glitch in the system, a teacher accidentally walking into the background of a teenage rant, he'd awakened. It was never about exposing the program. It was about reclaiming himself. Just as he stood to ask more, headlights slashed through the trees and a black SUV came crashing through the underbrush, military-grade and roaring like an animal. Savannah pushed Nate aside just as a tranquilizer dart whizzed past his face, embedding itself into the tree. Go, she screamed, drawing a weapon Nate hadn't seen before and firing it at the vehicle. The woods exploded in light and sound. Nate ran, cradling the drive like it was a living heart, like it contained his soul. He didn't look back. Not when he heard Savannah scream. Not when the woods behind him lit up with fire. He made it to the edge of the highway as dawn was breaking, covered in dirt and blood and sweat, and flagged down a lone trucker who slowed, confused, as Nate collapsed into the passenger seat. He handed the drive to the man with trembling hands. "You've got a phone, right?" The trucker nodded slowly. "Good," Nate said. "Plug this in. Post everything you see. Anywhere. Everywhere." The man looked uncertain but nodded. Then, just as Nate started to exhale, to believe he might finally be safe, the trucker smiled, too slowly, too knowingly, and said the words Nate had heard only once before, back in that video of Dylan. "Tell me what you remember about the original event. Begin at the mirror." And Nate realized, with soul-crushing certainty, that the trucker was one of them. It wasn't over. It had never even really begun. They found Nate a week later, 400 miles from where the farmhouse had burned down. He had been walking alone along a dusty back road in Arizona, sunburned, dehydrated, and half delirious, but still clutching the flash drive in his closed fist like it was the last tether to his sanity. The man who picked him up this time wasn't part of any program or surveillance operation, just a retired veteran hauling parts cross-country. He didn't ask questions, only gave Nate a bottle of water and let him sleep in the passenger seat, the kind of quiet human kindness that Nate had nearly forgotten still existed. When Nate woke, the truck was parked outside a public library and the man simply said, "You said you needed Wi-Fi." It took Nate a full 10 minutes to build the courage to plug the drive in, part of him terrified the files had been erased, corrupted, or booby-trapped somehow. But they were still there, all of them layered archives, memory logs, surveillance footage, behavioral reports on every subject who had ever been part of Project Mirrorline, including him. The uploads went slow at first, but Nate had learned enough to mask his IP and route the files across dozens of random proxies. He didn't aim for mainstream platforms, they'd be scrubbed too fast. Instead, he dumped the data on encrypted forums, dark web whistleblower boards, even video game chat servers where mods wouldn't immediately flag the content. And somehow, somewhere, it broke through. A cybersecurity YouTuber with a following of millions discovered it first, posting a detailed breakdown of what he called the most chilling digital leak in US history. Then came the Reddit sleuths, who verified fragments of video footage from inside real school districts, hinting that the project had infiltrated youth programs under the guise of social-emotional learning initiatives. TikTok lit up next, with teens reposting slowed-down clips of Nate's original video, the one where Mr. Keating accidentally appeared, overlaying eerie captions like, "Was he watching us back?" And they groomed our minds. #MemoryWipe started trending across platforms. But by the time the mainstream news tried to catch up, the deeper web had already gone silent again. Whistleblowers vanished. Accounts were wiped. Savannah's name was completely scrubbed from every hospital and personnel database. Mr. Keating resigned abruptly with no explanation, and the district issued a vague statement about staff realignment. Nate never went home again. He left behind his phone, deleted every trace of his social media, and started over with a different name, moving from town to town, taking odd jobs, always watching over his shoulder, always second-guessing every stranger's smile. But he felt free in a strange, fractured way. Not because he had exposed the truth entirely, he knew better than to think the world would change overnight, but because he had broken the loop. He had remembered. He had refused to be rewritten. And even if they buried everything he posted, even if they erased him next, someone out there had seen the files. Someone else now knew what to look for. Still, late at night, in rented rooms across unfamiliar cities, he would sit by the window and stare at his reflection, wondering how much of what he saw was really him. There were still things he couldn't explain, why the program had targeted him so young, what the original mirror event truly was, or why Savannah risked everything to protect him. He often dreamed of her, not as the operative she once was, but as the girl who cried watching forgotten footage, who called herself broken and still fought anyway. He never found out if she made it out of those woods, but sometimes he'd hear rumors, anonymous uploads, encrypted blog posts signed only with an emoji they used to joke about. A cracked mirror. Then one day, a package arrived at a rural post office where he'd been working under a fake name. No return address, just a burner phone inside, and a note that read, "Only you will know when to call." He stared at it for hours before placing it into his backpack without powering it on. He didn't need to know everything yet. Some truths took time. For now, he walked out into the fading light of another quiet evening, knowing that somewhere out there, pieces of the truth were still falling into place, and the mirror was still cracking. Not broken entirely, but enough for others to finally start seeing what had been hidden in plain sight. And as the sun dipped low, casting his shadow long across the gravel road, Nate finally smiled, not because the story was over, but because it wasn't. Not by a long shot.